Yeah, I'll react to that, sure. All right, I'm still waking up. Got my coffee. Melkor, you asked me to do this video not too long after I did the extra history, extra credits Great Northern War series. I finished that a few days ago, so I'm doing this now. And the Caroleans, strengths and weaknesses of Gapa. Let's do it. I got my learning hat on. I really do feel like I take on a new personality when I have this on. A better personality. Just, I'm ready to learn. If you're not ready to learn, there's the door. Get out. You will not be missed. Nobody loves you. No, you're sit back and chill. If you no, there's the door. You're in the wrong class. You are loved. All right. Let's go. Let's start. I'm still waking up, but I got my coffee.
Swedish. The subject of this video was voted on by my supporters at patreon.com. If you'd like to learn more about supporting my work and the benefits which you get for that support, you'll find a link for it in the description down below. Thank you. And also, a full disclosure before we begin here, I'm probably going to be mispronouncing an awful lot of Swedish terms throughout this video. Just
Hey,
be
that's
warned
my
about that.
specialty. I'll join with you.
Now, the Caroleans. The elite forces of the Swedish Empire, the famed legions of Carolus Rex. It was a rather short-lived army which ultimately failed, and yet it still captures the imagination of so many today. And while it certainly helps, their immense popularity probably owes itself to more than just a heavy metal album or two. Rather, the legacy of
Really?
this force lingers because of the impact it made, because of how they were able to punch above their weight for so long, able to repeatedly crush foes multiple times their own size. Their glory, yes, was short-lived, and it was also extraordinary. But while the reputation of the Caroleans is strong, and the rough outline of their story is relatively well known, again, largely I think thanks to a certain Swedish boot, what is generally less known is how the Caroleans actually operated. Why did they even come into existence? How did they fight? What were their techniques? Why were they so efficient? And of course, a less popular subject to discuss, what were their weaknesses? As indeed there did have to be some kind of flaw in those immortal soldiers of the Swedish Empire. Otherwise, you'd have to wonder how they ever lost in the first place. So, what was the ultimate cause of the Caroleans' defeat? Well, first things first, let's discuss their origins. Now, funnily enough, the story of the Caroleans doesn't start, as you may expect, during the height of the Swedish Empire, the early to mid-17th century, but actually towards the beginning of its end. You see, the term Carolean comes, as you may expect, from the name Carolus, or Charles, and more specifically from King Charles XI and King Charles XII. You see, they find their roots in the aftermath of the costly Scanian War, a term I probably just mispronounced, in which Sweden, allied with France, fought against the Danes and the Norwegians, the Dutch, and multiple Germanic states. It's a complicated history, but for our purposes here, suffice to say that the war was very costly for Sweden. They suffered
Sorry, but that's crazy because after learning, sorry, I put my phone over here. After learning a lot about, not a lot about the Great Northern War, but Great Northern War, the 30 Years' War as well, France and Sweden seem to be the two most capable armies, so that'd be a hell of a army to go against,
Suffice
I
to
would
say that
guess.
the war was very costly for Sweden. They suffered many losses which could not be easily replaced by a nation with relatively low manpower and low resources, and especially when compared to their neighbors in Denmark and more notably in Germany and even in Russia, which was soon to enter the stage in a very big way, but we'll get to the Russians soon enough, not to worry. You see, Charles XI, who was ruler at the time, realized that if the Swedish Empire was ever going to compete and retain its capacity as a great power, then being militarily dominant in a traditional fashion would not be enough for it. it would need to start punching well above its own weight to maintain that status. So he began instituting a series of economic and military reforms in Sweden aimed at achieving precisely that, greater levels of efficiency. Now, one of the most significant of these reforms he instituted was the method in which the Swedish army recruited, which was called the allotment system. Now, prior to Charles XI's reforms, under what is now referred to as the old system, the Swedish military grouped together 10 men of military age from every individual estate or collection of farms. Now, this collection of 10 men was called a rote, or a rote, something like that. And in the event of war, one of these 10 men would be conscripted for service in the army. Now, theoretically, this man would be chosen at random out of this collection of 10 men capable of military service. However, a system by which a man might purchase, or indeed bribe his way out of selection, meant that it may only ever be the poorest men who were actually being conscripted into the army. And in the event that this practice was truly random, as it was meant to be, well, it was hardly conducive to veterancy, or even to standardization, as of course you could be getting a different soldier every individual campaign. And those two things, veterancy and standardization, are becoming increasingly significant towards the end of the 17th century, and
Interesting.
indeed throughout the 18th century. Now, to combat these problems, Charles XI completely reformed the allotment system in the 1680s. This new system, as it's called, kept the same idea of the rote. The concept was the same, but it altered how the rotes were actually formed. You see, rather than being a small selection of military-aged men from every individual community, now the entire community represented a single rote. And every individual rote, say an estate or again a collection of farms, was given the duty of supplying a single soldier. This soldier was not conscripted, but they were usually a volunteer, and they were not randomly selected out of 10 men who just happened to be capable of doing military service, but he was a dedicated and professional soldier. This one man who took on military duties on behalf of his entire community was outfitted by that community, not only with a home and a farm, but with his uniform and other necessaries for military service. And the chief duties of these men consisted of attending drills, which usually lasted for about a month out of every single year, and of course fielding for regular service during times of actual war. So again, rather than having an individual community put up 10 people for potential military service, but their primary lives are as craftsmen and as farmers, as you'd expect, rather every individual community is putting up one person, and that is all they do. They are a soldier. You know, yes, they also have a farm and whatnot, but they are much more.
I learned about a similar thing in British history. I forget the name.
Dedicatedly a soldier, and the community is based around supporting them in that endeavor. Of course, there were exceptions to this recruitment policy, with both the Guards regiments, for example, and artillery regiments often recruiting in a more traditional style, as we've come to expect with other European powers. But these reforms overall represented a much more efficient use of Sweden's limited manpower pool, and at the same time they reduced the overall cost of maintenance and supply for the army, sort of decentralizing it all, while also allowing the army to become much more professional. Again, no longer are these men randomly selected, but they are continually providing service.
Okay. So it went from just, 6 minutes, 51 seconds in. It went from sort of a lottery tickets type style of each of these individual areas where you'd pick one person to a more, this person is the one from this area to go to war when they need people to go to war. That way it's not just a lottery ticket type thing where you might get this person this time and this person the next time. And so you get the same soldier who gets to build on their experience, and that will also make them a better soldier and make them win more battles, which makes a lot of sense. And so it's more of a job of a single person, or maybe a few if that person dies or is sick or unable to fight for some reason. And so it just makes a much more professional army. That makes sense.
It was out of these reforms that the new Carolean army was born. But of course, even with this increased efficiency and the professionalism at this organizational level, the Swedish army would still face problems of being vastly outnumbered by most of their neighbors. After all, they're not increasing their manpower, the number of rots and as such soldiers is not expanding here in any way, they're just using that manpower more efficiently. And so to be truly competitive, Charles XI would also need to reform how his army operated at a more tactical level, the battlefield level. And the new fighting style developed would be called gå på, and it would immortalize the Caroleans as one of the most fearsome, disciplined, and zealous armies of its day. Now, the basic principles of the gå på, which again I'm probably horribly mispronouncing, were very simple. You see, translated, the term directly means go on or go to. It emphasized rapid and decisive strikes against an enemy to disorganize and push them from the field before their inevitably greater numbers could condense and overwhelm the Swedish forces. And now, before we get into it, please understand that this explanation is of the ideal doctrine, and there were likely many, many different examples in which the Caroleans fought very differently as circumstances dictated. But broadly speaking, a Swedish battalion would form up 4 ranks deep. Now, this is a deep formation, but it's certainly not uncommon in the time period that they were operating in. The majority of this line, as you'd expect, were musketmen in the traditional style, with small groupings of grenadiers on the flanks and potentially at the van of the force, doing things like defending against cavalry and throwing grenades. Indeed, they were still using grenades in the early 18th century, unlike the late 18th century, which many of my own viewers are a bit more accustomed to. However, interestingly enough, around 1 in every 3 of the Carolean infantry were actually dedicated pikemen. And this is in a day and age where the use of pikes in linear warfare was very solidly dying out. In the past, of course, pikes would move alongside the muskets to protect them from cavalry, but the expanding prevalence of bayonets was lowering this need, and the
Hey, I wonder when bayonets would. I thought that'd be such a natural thing to do. Of course, put a bayonet or some dagger type stabbing weapon at the end of your musket so that you don't have to keep switching between spear and musket. But I wonder, maybe it just seemed like such an obvious thing that I don't think it's something where hindsight is 2020. Well, I very much like that doctrine. That now it's much easier to think what might be obvious to us might not be obvious in the time. You got to put yourself in those shoes, but thought maybe you would mess up the accuracy or whatnot. But okay, they're starting to do that.
increasing demands of mobility, again, standardization, and above all else, firing capacity meant that the age of pike and shot was already starting to die out by the mid-17th century, and by the time of the 18th, it was largely finished. But these Swedish pikes would form their own full companies, and they were either deployed throughout the line, or they could even be massed together in the very center of the line. Now, if their only job was to defend the muskets from cavalry, this would be horrible placement, as you'd want to have them on the more vulnerable flanks, and again, dispersed throughout the force to protect the muskets. And in particular, you'd never want to have such a massive portion of your line rendered completely impotent in a firefight by having it consist only of melee soldiers. But this isn't how the Caroleans used them. Rather, the Caroleans used their pikes not as defensive units, which was the traditional way they were always used in pike and shot warfare. Rather, the Caroleans used their pikemen in a very offensive capacity. The Caroleans didn't want to fight at range. They didn't want long, drawn-out firefights.
They even did this under Gustavus Adolphus, didn't they? I remember seeing this in the 30 Years' War from Kings and Generals.
To fight at range. They didn't want long, drawn-out firefights. Their emphasis was always on the charge, getting stuck in with the enemy in a melee fight. And that is the one place where the reach of a pike actually gives it a definitive edge over a musket with a bayonet. You see, the Caroleans would form their line and begin advancing towards their enemy. Now, naturally, an enemy volley is going to have significant effect when the Swedes are within, say, 75 to 125 yards, or thereabouts, again, very roughly speaking. But unlike most armies of the day, the Caroleans wouldn't stop at that range and then begin exchanging fire with the enemy. they keep on marching through the fire until they are within around 50 yards of their enemy, well within an effective range. And while the enemy is likely still reloading from what's probably their second volley at that point, if they're doing well, well, the rear two ranks of Carolean musketmen would step forward through gaps left specifically in the front ranks of the Caroleans, and they would fire their own volley. Now,
Right. I remember learning about this. I believe the 30 Years' War, right? It's just that, like, instead of, you shoot your volley and then you go behind in a much more defensive manner, you shoot and then you go behind and then the next line shoots and you go behind. Instead, they would shoot and then a line would come up in front of them and shoot and in front of them, and it's more of an offensive maneuver. So, yeah.
likely this would be a very, very efficient one. Certainly much more efficient than the first volley which the enemy threw against them, and potentially more than the enemy's second volley as well, assuming that they were even able to get it off before the Caroleans halted. Then the rear ranks would step back into their places, and rather than reload their pieces, they would draw their swords. Now, in these earlier years, the majority of the Caroleans did not actually have bayonets, but carried rapiers at their side, and I assume that they would be slinging their muskets across their backs before drawing them, rather than drop the muskets to the ground, but I couldn't find any information exactly on where they would put them. But suffice to say, they do not reload, they draw swords, ready again for a melee. The rear two ranks having done so, the force again would take up the advance. This time, it's a very short distance that they go, a very quickly closed distance, to around 20 yards from the enemy. Now the front two ranks would fire, and being right up on the enemy like that, that second Carolean volley would be utterly devastating.
Cool
Now, if the
painting.
plan is going well, by this time the enemy line is in complete disarray. The Swedes are moving quickly. They're not reloading, but they fire two volleys in very quick succession. Again, these men are well trained. They're very good at what they do. Odds are the enemy have only fired at most 3 volleys within an effective range at this point, and probably nowhere near so effective as that final volley was of the Caroleans at only 20 yards away. And while the enemy is in that disarray, they're trying to reload for their own close-range volley, well then the Caroleans charge in, through the smoke, with bayonet, sword, and pike, and with the initiative, with zeal, they drive the enemy from the field. Again, these men are well disciplined, they are well ordered, well maintained, and they are applying a great deal of force at a very particular point in the enemy's line, particularly again with those offensive pikes.
That's going to be
Even the
terrifying.
Swedish cavalry was emphasizing similar tactics. They would pack themselves much tighter in formation than most other forces of the day. It's actually said that their squadrons were placed knee behind knee instead of the more traditional wide.
Okay, so instead of spreading out their force and going on the whole line of the enemy, they would sort of bundle up and just thrust right through a particular part of the enemy line.
Wider
Okay.
spacing, and they would rarely ever use skirmishing tactics with their pistols and carbines, but preferred instead charging directly into the foe with their swords. In later years, for example during the Great Northern War against Russia, King Charles XII, Carolus Rex, would make even further changes to the tactics. He had his men form much tighter ranks for much stronger charges. He increased the use of bayonets over the rapier, which is much better in terms of the reach offered in a melee fight. He tightened the ranges of the fights even more dramatically, firing his own first volleys at only 20 yards instead of at 50. And he would even have his men run into that range instead of slowly march there, in order to reduce the casualties taken in those earlier stages of the battles when the Caroleans were at their most vulnerable. When these techniques worked, they allowed the Swedish army to defeat, rout, and even force the surrender of forces much larger than their own. They regularly defeated armies twice, 3, even 4 times their size throughout the early days of the 18th century. And oftentimes they were doing it with extraordinary casualty ratios as well, such as, for example, at the Battle of Narva in 1700, where up to 18,000 Russians became casualties, but under 2,000 Swedes were lost. There was the Battle of Warsaw in 1705, with 1,000 Saxon casualties to just around 300 Swedish. Or the Crossing of the Duna, 1701, 2,000 casualties to only 500. The list goes on. Again, the Swedish were continually, during this time period, punching well above their weight. They relied above all else on extreme discipline, on cohesion, and indeed courage within their ranks. They had to. They couldn't afford to raise anywhere near the number of soldiers that their enemies could. The soldiers that they did have had to count. But all the same, as we said earlier, the days of the Caroleans truly were the final days of the Swedish Empire. But with how we've described them thus far, how can that be? Why, they sound almost invincible.
Well, not everything is going to come down to how good your soldiers are.
Why didn't every army immediately adopt these Carolean methods? Why didn't the Swedes crush the Russians in the Great Northern War, retain their status as a great power? Well, as much as fans of those certain heavy metal bands would hate to admit it, the Caroleans were very far from perfect, and the tactics and strategies of men like Carolus Rex, while they were very impressive, also had many flaws, and ultimately these flaws would lead to their defeat and annihilation. But before we do get to those weaknesses, I do believe it is time for a very quick ad read. I know, it's exciting stuff, but please do try to contain yourself. I am going to start making these a little bit more common in the future. Look, I'm greedy. I need to pay my rent, so get over it. Last time I introduced you to my new website, brandonf.com, where I offer private tours of Boston. Visit today.
I'll skip through it.
Amazon. Below, Isle of War system. Thank you very much, and thank you for your time. Now on to the weaknesses of the Carolean system. First, we'll talk about the tactical weaknesses and why the Carolean style of warfare did not come to dominate the 18th century, even if, yes, certain aspects of it did carry on through the time period. Then we'll go on to the larger, more existential, strategic weaknesses of how Sweden carried out its campaigns. The thing about the Caroleans is that on paper, yes, they were incredible. When you describe the basic principles of their strategies in a vacuum, as we did just earlier, it does indeed make them sound invincible. But of course, warfare is not fought in a vacuum. At least not yet. And we all know that even the soundest of doctrines tend to unravel a little bit when meeting first contact with the enemy. Let's talk a little bit more about those pikes. Now, if you can maintain the Gaupo momentum, drive forward, reach the enemy lines, as long as they kept their good order, that concentrated mass of long-reach melee soldiers will perform excellently. But what if they don't? What if the line falters? What if the charge breaks? What if elements of it get bogged down here and there under overwhelming fire from an enemy? All of a sudden, as we've mentioned earlier, you've just rendered a third of your force completely impotent. Odds are the Caroleans are already outnumbered, which means any sort of protracted engagement will not end in their favor. And if the pikes are massed, suddenly you've just rendered an entire section of your line, the center of it for goodness sake, incapable of providing support to the other sections unless they charge and commit themselves.
It's a problem. If you have something like this, you better make sure it's successful and that you hit it. Otherwise,
is why the bayonet actually wins out over the pike. It provides versatility. It means that individual companies of troops can perform a variety of different tasks, that if nothing else, if a charge seems to falter, at least they can still have some sort of effect on the battlefield by, well, firing their muskets. A pike is only really good for two things: defending from a charge or carrying one out. The former is purely responsive, and it is of no use to you if, like the Caroleans, you rely on seizing initiative in the battle and dictating how it is to be fought. You're always having to be on the offensive. And the latter is only practical in very particular circumstances. And once committed, it's very difficult to bring pikemen back from that charge, especially if they've got stuck in with the enemy. Now, of course, if you disperse your pikes throughout your line, as was often done, these issues are lessened.
I gotta turn up my air conditioning. Sorry.
but you're still reducing your overall firepower by a third and can easily run into situations where you have significant portions of your soldiery just standing around waiting for an opportunity to charge, while the musketmen are firing all around them. Again, these are some of the bigger reasons why these were the final days of the pike. And again, if you have all of your pikemen massed in your center, well, even if that charge carries on perfectly, you are still having a third of your line which is not able to send out any firepower, but is receiving an awful lot of it. If you're going up against a very disparate, poorly organized enemy, then that can be okay. But if you're going up against an enemy force which is well disciplined and is able to maintain a good, accurate rate of fire, well, your men are going to be suffering an awful lot, and then run up against an enemy which has suffered very few casualties, just really from artillery, up to that point. While the musketmen on the flanks are going up against a disorganized enemy because of, they're suffering those two massive volleys from 50 and then 20 yards away, well, the pikemen are going up against a center which is presumably ready to fight, ready to go, and actually meet the enemy that's advancing on them, even if that enemy does have a disadvantage in terms of overall reach. Now let's circle back to a point we hinted to earlier, that idea of momentum. The Caroleans relied on strong momentum in their charge, but a charge can only really be carried on so much. It can only go on for so long. If you don't have an element of surprise, or if you're going up against a well-prepared, fortified enemy, it will very possibly fail. For a good example, look at the Battle of Poltava, 1709, in which the Swedish forces came up against a Russian army which was well prepared for them.
And was like
entrenched
5
within
times
6
their
forts and
size.
4 redoubts. Many of these fortifications were able to provide support to one another, crossfires. This is a nightmare situation for the Caroleans. Now, yes, they can push forward and take one of those redoubts just fine, and then another, and then even another. But after every single push, every time you try to move on to another redoubt, you become weakened. The men become tired. It becomes very rapidly an
Sometimes quantity
uphill
is
struggle. In many
better than
circumstances,
quality.
possibly literally an uphill struggle. If they outnumbered
Sometimes.
the Russians, that may not be a problem. But the Caroleans are almost always outnumbered. They can only ever apply so much force in so many different places at any one given time. And at the Battle of Poltava, as those continued assaults on Russian positions across the line began to falter with increasing intensity, well, the Russians start to isolate individual Swedish battalions and overwhelm them. They even got to reoccupy some of the redoubts that the Swedes took earlier, making it all the more difficult for the Swedes to carry on with and maintain any sense of momentum that they may have had earlier on in the battle. And this is all in a battle where the Swedes were only outnumbered 2-1. Now, yes, that's very bad odds, but they'd faced much worse situations before in terms of numbers alone. But the Caroleans faced much worse, were only outnumbered earlier on in the battle. And this is all in a battle where the Swedes were only outnumbered 2-1.
I thought they were outnumbered like 15,000 to 80,000 or something like that.
Now, yes, that's very bad odds, but they
Am I
faced
thinking of a
much
different
worse
battle?
situations before in terms of numbers alone. But the Caroleans are kind of like a glass cannon. If they break your line, if they turn your flanks and send you running with their rapid, hard-hitting charge, then you're done. You're finished.
Ooh, that's a
But
cool
that
painting.
momentum can only be carried
Ooh.
so far.
Ooh, I like that painting. I want that as my background.
Yes, they break through your first line, but what if there's a second line? And then a third line, and a fourth line. Eventually, the Caroleans get bogged down. They get forced into those extended firefights which they so fear. They get isolated, cut off from other units. They get picked off, and ultimately, they get destroyed. And the worst thing for the Swedish Empire is that it only has to happen to them once. They can only ever have one disaster. And now we come to the wider problem, the existential problem of the Caroleans. That there were only ever really between 40 to 50,000 of them at most. Remember, Sweden has to punch continually above its weight. It does not have the manpower or the resources to continually field and resupply armies much more massive than that.
Honestly, it's surprising they
In the
lasted as
end,
long as
it
they
doesn't
did with
exactly matter if you're able to get a casualty ratio of 3 to 1
the
if
number
the
ratio.
enemy has 4 men for every one of yours and they're willing to carry on the war. You will run out of men before they do. If you cannot force them to a peace treaty, if they're willing to carry on the fight, they will beat you. And if you're on the charge, if you're on the offensive, then you can do very well. That's where the zeal, discipline, speed, cohesion, all of the things that the Caroleans know best, well, that's where they all matter the most. But when you get bogged down in a protracted firefight, well, the musket ball from a Russian conscript will kill a finely trained and equipped Carolean veteran just the same as it'll kill any other kind of soldier. And so too will disease kill your veteran soldiers, and the cold of winter, and the privation of a long campaign.
I'm just getting
And
tired.
if the enemy is determined to see you defeated, and they start burning their own crops
that
along
Peter?
your road of march, and if
Russia
they continually raid your columns, attack your supply lines, well,
scores
they can
through.
afford to take those losses. And you cannot. Sound familiar? While you can point to something like the Battle of Poltava and show the weaknesses of how the Caroleans fought when applied to very particular circumstances, well, there are also going.
Am I messing up the battles, or did extra credits get the numbers wrong? I'm assuming I'm wrong.
Plenty of examples where the Caroleans overcame
But I thought they were
worse odds.
much more than 2 to 1
The real
outnumbered.
problem with the Carolean system was much larger than can ever be exposed in any individual battle, as is often the case with history. The entirety of the Great Northern War was a story of erosion, the slow whittling away of the Swedish forces. Even in victory after victory, they could not afford to continually replace the men that they were losing. The Caroleans were a small, elite fighting force, one of the most disciplined and capable ones of their day. Had they been fighting smaller wars, or 100 years earlier, then maybe things would have ended differently for them. But they were fighting in the 18th century, at the slow dawning of a new style of warfare. Armies were becoming more professional across the board, more standardized. They were becoming larger, more versatile, more modern.
So if the professionalism gap is closing and that yet the numbers problem ratio isn't, then
logistics and the economy of scale were slowly but surely taking over the battlefields of Europe. Now, of course, this was a very large subject that there were an awful lot of complexities that we were not able to discuss here. The greater niceties of how the Swedes fought, the immense role that the personalities and abilities of men like King Charles XI and XII that played in these campaigns, and why they were even fighting the Russians and the Danes and the Norwegians to begin with, all warrant their own attention. And if you're interested in learning more about that subject, you might consider a book called The Swedish Army of the Great Northern War, 1700 to 1721, by Lars Eriksson Volke. Full disclosure, I've not actually read that book myself, but I have seen bits and
Lars Eriksson, that's like the most Nordic name ever.
pieces of it, and it does come recommended by a friend of mine who did read through the whole thing, and he knows an awful lot more about the Swedish military history than I do. He helped me with a lot of the research for this video.
This guy over here looks drunk. I'd probably be drunk.
Naturally, you'll find an Amazon referral linked to that book down below. And as well, you might take interest in a video produced by another YouTube channel, a certain Mr. Yankee Chronicles. He's a bit of a smaller fish at the moment, yes, but he is making good strides in the overall quality of his content.
I'm a small
and
fish.
he's made a video all about the Russian side.
I'm not a
of
content
things.
creator, though. I'm a reactor because I just don't have the discipline and the know-how to do all this great stuff.
In the Great Northern War, why they were fighting the war, how their victory really propelled them to take over Sweden's spot as the chief power in that part of the world. His video as well, I'll be sure to link in the description down below. Thank you all for watching, of course in particular to my ever-beneficent
Thanks, Brandon F. Great channel. Great video about a topic I definitely did not know much about. Sorry if I seemed too clueless at many points, but I'm still learning. Awesome video. Gonna get back to some English history, and then continue the Second Punic War. Right? Hannibal series. All right. See you guys next time.